This is Randolph Mantooth, better known as Johnny Gage from Emergency. So at what point did you realize how unique your name was?
Well, I think I always sort of knew that because even as a kid, I traveled around an awful lot when I was a kid. In fact, before I was 18 years old, I lived in 25 states.
Ooh.
And so when you're just this little kid running around with a name like Randy Mantooth, kids have a real ball with your name.
Oh, I bet.
Mantooth, baby tooth, tiger tooth, woman tooth. And so I think I knew pretty early on that this name was probably either going to be my success or my downfall.
And how did you land the role of Johnny Gage in Emergency? How did that all come about?
Well, I had just graduated from the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, and Universal signed me to a contract, brought me out, put me in front of a camera 2 or 3 times on a couple shows. And the producer and creator of Emergency, Bob Senator, saw me and said, "That's Johnny Gage." And I didn't even know that they had a show. And he went into Jack Webb and said, "I think I found our Johnny Gage." And Jack went and saw this piece of film this little small role that I did with Hal Holbrook. At the time, I played this young lieutenant who gave the order to fire at Kent State. They saw the film. And then they went to my bosses at Universal and said, "This is who we want." And I was marched into the office, and they told me to sit down. And they said, "You're going to be playing Johnny Gage, Los Angeles County firefighter paramedic Johnny Gage, on a television show called Emergency." The first thing I said was, "What the hell's a paramedic?"
Yeah, oh, really? Didn't know. So, well, before we get to that, this is Randolph Mantooth, who is best known as Johnny Gage from Emergency. So you must have known for a long time you wanted to be an actor then.
Yeah, I pretty much did, because I was always doing school plays and high school plays, especially high school. That's where it all started to kind of focus in for me. Mm-hmm. So I knew pretty much all my friends were as my dad always says, thespians, and so we all kind of took off. There was about I guess there were maybe 20 of us all left from the town that I was living in Santa Barbara, California. We all decided, hey, we want to go to New York, and so we all kind of took off and found our own different ways of getting to New York and going to the American Academy. So I knew pretty well.
Okay, so your role on Emergency, getting back to that, this is Randolph Mantooth, who played Johnny Gage on Emergency, was a firefighter/paramedic, and you hadn't heard before what a paramedic was?
Yeah, nobody really knew what a paramedic was, because at the time that the show was on, there were only 8 paramedics in all of California.
Wow.
And, of course, nobody knew what paramedic was. The first thing I said was, "What's a paramedic? Is that like a doctor who parachutes on the sick people? I mean, what is that?" And but then I quickly found out, along with the rest of the country, we quickly found out what a paramedic is.
Well, why don't you explain that a little bit? How the show Emergency, what role it played in paramedics, and all the way where we are today with that.
Well, Emergency certainly didn't invent paramedics. That's for sure. In fact, the whole concept of paramedics, of having firefighters out in the field acting as the eyes and ears of the doctor, was a extremely resisted idea. It was resisted by doctors. It was resisted by nurses because they felt threatened. And it was resisted by, of course, politicians, because who the hell wants to pay for this thing?
Right.
And believe it or not, it was really strongly resisted by fire departments, because their mantra was, we put out fires, we don't deliver babies. And but there were 4 doctors who absolutely just kept hammering home how important this was and how possible it was, because some cardiologists said, you can't mess around with somebody's heart out in the field. Well, we now know that that's just a fallacy.
Right.
But at the time, the hallowed halls of cardiology were just in an uproar that people could have the audacity to think that you could actually treat somebody's heart out in the field. You have to bring them to the hospital and let the experts deal with them. So these 4 doctors, they couldn't get it off the ground, but in Los Angeles, Harbor General Hospital, which we later renamed Rampart, and the Los Angeles County Fire Department had this little program where they were training these paramedics, but there still wasn't a law saying that they could actually that would certify them to go out in the field and do what they did. And finally, when they got that passed, it was still this idea that really hadn't come to fruition yet. And then Bob Senator Jack Webb wanted to do another show. He was doing Adam 12 at the time, and he knew that show was about to be canceled, and he didn't want to be caught without a show on the air, so he told Bob to get down and see what he could come up with. And Bob came up with this idea about paramedics in an emergency, and once it was on the air, it was like letting the genie out of the bottle. There was no stopping it at that point. And so what Emergency did was it just literally exposed a program that was already going, but was in its death throes because nobody wanted it and nobody wanted to pay for it, and all the resistance that I just talked about earlier. But once it was out there, once the public looked up from their dinner plates and said, what's this? Is this true? Can this really be? And once that happened, then there was no going back.
This is Randolph Mantooth. You probably know him as Johnny Gage from Emergency. Now, the reason that we're talking to you about this is you are going to represent Ministry Healthcare coming up this Thursday.
Well, I've been asked by Ministry Healthcare to come and help celebrate and to honor pretty much their past histories with your area, and in particular, the 15th anniversary, I believe, anyway, of your Spirit Medical Transportation Service.
Yeah, this is the 14th annual.
Oh, it is the 14th.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I gave it a year.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'm going to be there to tell everyone about the history of EMS. It's called EMS Then and Now, and it's about what we just talked about how they were putting firefighters out in the field to act as the eyes and ears and the hands of the doctor.
Okay, so if somebody's attending the 14th Annual Spirit Conference, they'll get to hear that. But you also have a meet and greet scheduled for the general public.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, on Thursday from 4 to 6 at the Ramada Inn, Stevens Point.
If you say so.
Yes.
I'm just told to show up and smile.
Okay, well, I'm sure you do that very well. Speaking of which, when you go do these meet and greets, you have to run into it would be a woman now, or two, that was a teenager back in the 70s when Emergency was on that had kind of a crush on Johnny Gage.
Yeah. When we were doing the show, I feel like Kevin was the nation's babysitters at that time. When we were doing that show, when the show was actually airing, you have to understand we were against All in the Family for 6 of those 7 years. We never won our hour. All in the Family won every one of them, but we were the strongest against it only because the kids were watching it. So when we were doing the show, Kevin and I, we couldn't go into a supermarket because the kids would follow us down the hall, down the aisle and say, "Oh, look, he's buying mayonnaise," So we were like hounded out of there. Now, when the show ended and it went into syndication, all these kids grew up, and while we were doing the show, we could go into the bars. Nobody knew who we were because it was on at 8 o'clock on Saturday night, so they're certainly not at home watching Emergency. So,
well, I was. That was bath night for me.
Well, then after the show finished and we and then we went into syndication, all these kids kind of grew up and they moved into the bars. So now we couldn't go into the bars, but we got our supermarkets back.
Uh-huh. Well, I find this is Randolph Mantooth. You probably know him as Johnny Gage from Emergency. I find it interesting that you took this television role, and I know that having looked at what you've done as an actor, you've done much more as a writer, producer, director, all those kinds of things, but that you've chosen to take this role and now bring it this far forward, to 2009, that you're still involved in this way.
Well, there's two reasons for that. Number one, and it's not just because the industry, the life-saving industry itself, gave me a job for 7 years, but it did, and I'm terribly grateful for it. But it was there's a variety of reasons. Number one, the type of people that I surrounded myself with for those 7 years they were a special kind of human being that I had never really been exposed to before in my life. They were caring, highly motivated people who, for very little money, went out and risked their lives and their reputations for the sole purpose of saving other people's lives. I had never really been exposed to people like that before. So they made a monumental change in my life, and they taught me life lessons, taught both Kevin and I life lessons that we still carry with us to this very day.
And do you find those people that do it today are the same way?